My schizophrenic dad begged me not to talk to the people only he could see. He said, "They'll notice you, and if they notice you, they'll never leave." When I told him I could see them too, he backed away like I was a ghost. I didn't follow him. That was last spring. Today, he told a judge he was stable enough to keep me, and they believed him. Growing up, I thought everybody's dad had imaginary friends who made their dad sad and angry. One minute he'd be calm, the next these friends would appear, and my dad would start shouting at thin air, crying and arguing with people who weren't there. One time when I was 6 years old, he threw a plate across the room, shattering it against the wall, yelling, "Josh, get out of my head!" He ran upstairs after that, and I remember breaking down crying. I hated Josh, whoever he was, so I followed my dad upstairs, hoping to maybe catch him talking to his imaginary friends so I could step in and give out to them for making my dad. But instead, I saw something that made me happy. My dad was convinced by another imaginary friend of his to take something. It was some sort of medicine. My dad passed out on his bed right after, and I remember being so happy he had at least one imaginary friend who chose to help him and calm him down. That was the night I made the decision to protect my dad. I decided I needed to scare his imaginary friends away. And so, every time he started arguing with them, I started yelling at the corners too, telling those mean imaginary people to leave him alone. But the first time I tried, Dad looked terrified. He grabbed me by the shoulders and begged, his voice cracking, telling me never to talk to them again. I could tell it made things worse for him, and after that, I just felt helpless. But I still wanted to help somehow. I figured if Dad's imaginary friends were going to stick around, maybe they could at least be nice. So I came up with my own imaginary friends. Mine were friendly and funny. I'd host gatherings with empty chairs and pretend conversations, laughing and giggling, making sure Dad saw how much fun I was having. I hoped it'd teach him that pretend people didn't have to be mean, that maybe he could trade Josh and the others for nicer friends. But that didn't help either. If anything, Dad got worse. Sometimes he'd just stare at me with this creepy look. One day, while we were eating lunch, he leaned close and whispered, "You see them too?" I could hear the trembling in his voice, and I saw tears well up in his eyes. It freaked me out, but it broke my heart too. He looked like he felt guilty, like he'd passed some horrible secret down to me. From then on, he'd talk to me about it sometimes, whispering things like, "I'm sorry, kid. At least now you understand." It made me feel weird, scared and confused, but also kind of special, like we had a secret together. But then came the worst night. Dad had been yelling for hours, his voice hoarse and desperate, so loud it echoed around our apartment. He yelled especially loud at Josh. When he finally crashed and went quiet, I snuck into his room with the intention of making sure the friends hadn't harmed my dad. Thankfully, I found him asleep without injuries. But then I discovered something even worse, a diary hidden under the bed. My heart stopped when I read what was inside. Turns out, Josh wasn't an imaginary friend. Josh was Dad's childhood best friend, who passed away drunk driving while in the same car as my dad. And Dad couldn't stop seeing him. What's even worse, Dad had written down that Josh was telling him to unalive me and then himself to end our suffering. I stared at those words for a long minute, feeling like I couldn't breathe. I didn't want to die. I don't remember running to the phone, but I remember holding it and whispering to the 911 operator, "My daddy's imaginary friends want him to hurt me, and I need help making them go away forever." My voice sounded small and far away, like it belonged to someone else. I couldn't tell you what happened next. The full story is on my channel and linked below. The next few hours were a blur. I remember police officers showing up at our door, their uniforms dark against the night, flashlights sweeping across our living room. I was sitting in the living room wrapped in a blanket someone had given me, a scratchy blue thing that smelled like mothballs. Dad was still asleep upstairs when they arrived, unaware that everything was about to change. I heard heavy footsteps going up the stairs, the creak of his bedroom door opening. There was shouting. Dad sounded confused and scared, his voice rising in panic. They brought him downstairs in handcuffs, the metal glinting in the harsh light of the police flashlights. His hair was messy from sleep, and he was still wearing his faded Batman t-shirt and sweatpants. He kept looking at me with these sad eyes, like a wounded animal. I couldn't look at him. I just stared at the floor and cried, my tears making dark spots on the carpet. One of the officers, a lady named Officer Martinez, sat next to me and talked really softly. She had kind eyes and smelled like vanilla. She asked me questions about Dad's friends and the diary. I told her everything I knew, my words tumbling out between sobs. Dad got taken away in a police car. I watched from the window as the lights flashed red and blue across our front yard, illuminating the old oak tree where my tire swing hung motionless in the night air. Officer Martinez told me I would be staying with my Aunt Shirley for a while. I didn't even know I had an Aunt Shirley. Turns out she was my mom's sister. Mom left when I was 2, so I barely remembered her, just a vague impression of floral perfume and soft laughter. Aunt Shirley lived about an hour away in a part of town I'd never visited. She came to pick me up that night, arriving in an old Chevy that backfired when she parked. She had this wild curly hair dyed an unnatural shade of red and smelled like cigarettes and cheap perfume. She didn't say much on the drive to her place, just occasionally glancing at me in the rearview mirror with an expression I couldn't read. I sat in the back seat with a small bag of clothes the officers helped me pack, clutching my stuffed rabbit Mr. Hoppy to my chest. I kept thinking about Dad's diary and Josh. I wondered if Josh was sitting next to me in the car, angry that I had called the police. The thought made me press myself against the door, as far away from the empty seat beside me as possible. Aunt Shirley's apartment was small and messy, located located on the third floor of a building with a broken elevator. There were magazines everywhere and dirty dishes in the sink. The air smelled of stale cigarettes and microwave dinners. She showed me to a pull-out couch where I'd be sleeping, the springs poking through the thin mattress. I didn't care. I was too tired and scared to care about anything. I just wanted to sleep and forget everything, to disappear into dreams where dads didn't have scary friends and families stayed together. The next morning, Aunt Shirley made pancakes. They were burnt on one side and raw on the other, nothing like the perfect golden circles Dad used to make on Sunday mornings. I ate them anyway, drowning them in syrup to mask the taste. She sat across from me at her tiny kitchen table, cigarette dangling from her lips, and finally started talking. She told me Dad had something called schizophrenia. It made him see and hear things that weren't really there. She said Mom left because she couldn't handle it anymore, couldn't bear to watch the man she loved disappear into his own mind. I asked her about Josh, picking at the peeling Formica tabletop with my fingernail. She got real quiet for a minute, taking a long drag from her cigarette. Then she told me the whole story. Dad and Josh were both 17 when it happened. They were coming home from a party. Josh was driving and he'd been drinking. The car crashed into a tree on Maple Street, the same street we drove down to get to school every morning. Josh died instantly. Dad survived with just a few scratches, a miracle the doctors couldn't explain. He blamed himself for not taking the keys from Josh, for not being the responsible one. Your dad was never the same after that, Aunt Shirley said while lighting another cigarette, the match flaring briefly in the dim kitchen. The guilt ate him up inside. That's when the voices started. I spent the next few days just watching TV and thinking about Dad. The cartoons I usually loved seemed flat and meaningless now. Aunt Shirley wasn't much for conversation. She worked nights at some factory and slept most of the day, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the constant drone of the television. I was pretty much on my own, making sandwiches when I got hungry and putting myself to bed. I kept wondering where Dad was and if he was okay, if he missed me as much as I missed him. On the fourth day, a social worker named Dana came to visit. She had curly brown hair and wore a pantsuit that looked too warm for the summer heat. She had a clipboard and asked me a bunch of questions about living with Dad. She wanted to know if he ever hurt me or forgot to feed me. I told her no. Dad was always good to me, except when his friends made him upset. He made sure I had clean clothes and helped me with my homework. He read me stories before bed and checked under the bed for monsters. Dana wrote everything down and told me I was being very brave, her pen scratching against the paper like a small animal digging for safety. After she left, Aunt Shirley told me Dad was in a hospital. Not a regular hospital, but a special one for people whose brains work differently. She said he'd be there for a while, getting the help he needed. I asked if I could visit him, my voice small with hope. She said maybe, but not yet. He needed time to get better first. I nodded, but inside I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out all my insides and left just a shell. A week passed. I started school at a new place, Westridge Elementary. The building was bigger than my old school, the hallways confusing mazes that made me late to class twice. The kids there were okay, I guess. I didn't tell anyone about Dad or his friends. I just said I was staying with my aunt for a while. The teachers all gave me these sad looks like they knew something was wrong. I hated those looks, the pity in their eyes that made me feel different, damaged. One night, I woke up to Aunt Shirley talking on the phone. She was trying to be quiet, but her apartment was small, the walls thin as paper. I could hear her clearly from the pull-out couch, her voice carrying through the darkness. I can't keep him forever, Raymond, she was saying. Raymond was my dad's brother, my uncle. I'd only met once or twice at a family reunion years ago. I work nights. The kid is practically raising himself here. You need to step up. I pretended to be asleep when she checked on me after hanging up, keeping my breathing slow and even. My stomach felt all twisted, like I'd swallowed a bunch of snakes. I didn't want to be passed around like some unwanted package, a burden nobody wanted to bear. I wanted to go home with Dad, to our apartment with the tire swing and the floral wallpaper, even if it meant dealing with his imaginary friends. The next day, Dana the social worker came back. She told me Dad was doing better on his new medication. She said I might be able to visit him soon. That made me feel a little better, a small flame of hope flickering to life inside me. Then she dropped the bomb that I might be going to stay with Uncle Raymond for a while. Uncle Raymond lived in Michigan, hundreds of miles away. I'd have to change schools again, make new friends again, start over again. I waited until Dana left. Then I found Aunt Shirley in the kitchen. She was making coffee, the ancient percolator gurgling on the counter. Dana said I might be able to see Dad soon, I said, trying to sound casual. Can we go visit him? Aunt Shirley sighed, running a hand through her frizzy red hair. I'll call the hospital and see what they say. No promises, though. 2 days later, she surprised me by announcing we'd be visiting Dad that weekend. A case manager from social services would meet us there to supervise the visit. I was so excited I could barely sleep the night before. When Saturday finally came, I was up at dawn, dressed and ready hours before we needed to leave. The psychiatric facility was about 5 miles away, housed in a big gray building that looked more like an office complex than a hospital. We met the case manager, a woman named Abigail, in the lobby. She had a kind smile but serious eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She explained the rules to me. The visit would last 1 hour, we'd be in a supervised room, and if Dad seemed upset or agitated at any point, the visit would end immediately. I nodded, willing to agree to anything just to see him. When they brought Dad in, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked thinner, his face gaunt and pale. His hair was cut short, almost a buzz cut, so different from his usual shaggy style. But his eyes lit up when he saw me, and his smile was the same. "Hey buddy," he said, his voice rough like he hadn't used it much lately. I wanted to run to him, but something held me back. Uncertainty maybe, or the sterile environment with its watchful eyes. Dad seemed to understand. He sat down at the table and patted the chair next to him. "It's okay, I'm still me." That broke the ice. I sat beside him, and soon we were talking like normal. About school, about the cartoons I'd been watching, about how Aunt Shirley couldn't make pancakes to save her life. Dad laughed at that, a real laugh that made him look more like himself. He told me about the hospital, how he was taking medicine that helped keep Josh and the other voices quiet. He was seeing a therapist every day and attending group sessions with other people who had similar problems. "I'm getting better," he promised. "It's going to take time, but I'm working hard." I believed him. There was a clarity in his eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. The hour passed too quickly. When Abigail said it was time to go, I didn't want to leave. Dad hugged me tight and whispered, "I'm so sorry for scaring you. I love you more than anything in the world." I hugged him back, breathing in his hospital soap smell, trying to memorize the feeling of his arms around me. "I love you too, Dad." In the car on the way back to Aunt Shirley's, I felt lighter somehow. Dad was getting help. He was still my dad. Maybe things would be okay eventually. The next week, Dana came by with official papers. Uncle Raymond would be taking temporary custody of me, while Dad continued his treatment. There would be court hearings and evaluations, but for now, I needed a stable place to live, and Aunt Shirley's apartment with her night shifts wasn't cutting it. Uncle Raymond arrived 3 days later. He looked a lot like Dad, just shorter and with a beard that was more salt than pepper. He seemed nice enough, with laugh lines around his eyes and a gentle handshake. He brought me a new backpack with planets on it and some books about a kid detective. He said I'd be coming to live with him and his wife Lauren in Michigan. They had a spare bedroom all ready for me, painted blue with glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling. I didn't want to go. I wanted to stay close to Dad, but nobody was asking what I wanted. Aunt Shirley seemed relieved to be handing me off, already talking about reclaiming her space. I packed my few belongings and got ready to leave with Uncle Raymond the next morning, folding my clothes carefully into my new backpack. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Dad all alone in that hospital, surrounded by strangers in white coats. I wondered if Josh was still bothering him, or if the medicine was keeping Josh away. I decided then that I needed to tell Dad I wasn't mad at him, that I understood it wasn't his fault. I wrote him a letter, pouring out all my feelings in my messy 10-year-old handwriting. I told him I knew about Josh now, the real Josh, not just the scary voice. I told him I didn't blame him for what happened. I said I would be good for Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren, but that I wanted to come home when he was better. I sealed the letter in an envelope and gave it to Aunt Shirley the next morning, asking her to make sure Dad got it. She promised she would. The drive to Michigan with Uncle Raymond was long but not uncomfortable. He was easy to talk to, asking me questions about school and my favorite movies, telling me stories about when he and Dad were kids. He didn't shy away from talking about Dad's illness either. "Your dad's been struggling with this for a long time," he explained as we crossed the state line. "After Josh died, he started having episodes, but he'd hide them or self-medicate. When your mom got pregnant with you, he tried really hard to get better. He was on medication, seeing doctors regularly. For a while it worked." "What happened?" I asked, watching the highway signs flash by. Uncle Raymond sighed. "Your mom leaving hit him hard. He stopped taking his meds, stopped seeing his doctors. He convinced himself he was fine, that he could handle it on his own. But schizophrenia doesn't work that way. It's like diabetes. You need treatment for life." That made sense to me. Dad had always been adamant about not needing those pills whenever Aunt Shirley mentioned them in the past. I wondered if he'd keep taking them this time, or if he'd stop again once he felt better. Uncle Raymond's house was nice, a 2-story place with a big yard in a neighborhood full of similar houses. Aunt Lauren was waiting on the porch when we pulled up. She was younger than Uncle Raymond with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. She hugged me like she'd known me forever. "We're so glad you're here," she said, leading me inside. "I hope you like the room we set up for you." The room was bigger than my old one, with a desk and bookshelf along with the bed. The promised glow-in-the-dark stars covered the ceiling. It was nice, but it didn't feel like mine. Nothing here did. The first few weeks were an adjustment. Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren were kind but had lots of rules. Bedtime was strictly enforced. Meals were at the same time every day. I had to keep my room clean and do chores to earn an allowance. It was more structure than I was used to with Dad. The new school was okay. I was still the new kid, but a boy named Kyle showed me around and let me sit with him at lunch. He lived down the street and had a PlayStation, which was cool. We started hanging out after school sometimes. Dad called every Sunday like he promised. The conversations were awkward at first. He'd ask about school and friends, and I'd give short answers because I didn't know what else to say. How do you talk normally to someone who's in a psychiatric hospital? But as weeks passed, it got easier. Dad sounded more like his old self each time, telling jokes and asking about books I was reading. About a month after I moved to Michigan, I had a nightmare about Josh. In the dream, he was standing at the foot of my bed, telling me Dad was never coming back for me. I woke up crying and scared. Aunt Lauren heard me and came in, sitting on the edge of my bed and rubbing my back until I calmed down. "Do you want to talk about it?" she asked. I told her about the nightmare, and about how I used to think Dad's hallucinations were imaginary friends. She listened without interrupting, her face soft in the glow of the nightlight. "Your dad's illness isn't your fault," she said when I finished. "And it's not his fault either. It's like having diabetes or asthma. It's just something some people have to deal with." "Will I get it too?" I asked, voicing the fear that had been growing inside me since I learned the truth. Aunt Lauren hesitated. There's a higher risk when it runs in families, but most people with a parent who has schizophrenia don't develop it themselves, and there are lots of treatments now. That was somewhat reassuring, but I still worried. What if I started seeing people who weren't there too? What if I ended up in a hospital like Dad? The next day at school, I couldn't concentrate. I kept thinking about Dad and Josh, and whether I might someday have my own imaginary friends. During recess, I sat alone on a bench, watching other kids play. Kyle came over and sat beside me. "You okay? You're acting weird today." I shrugged. I hadn't told any kids at school about Dad. I was afraid they'd think I was crazy too, or that they wouldn't want to be friends with me. But Kyle had been nice to me since day one, and I was tired of keeping secrets. "My dad's in a hospital," I said quietly. "Not a regular hospital, a mental one." I waited for Kyle to make a face or walk away. Instead, he just nodded. "My cousin was in one of those for a while. She tried to hurt herself. Is your dad going to be okay?" The simple question, asked without judgment, made my eyes water. "I think so. He has schizophrenia. He sees and hears things that aren't real." "That sucks," Kyle said. "But at least he's getting help, right?" I nodded, surprised by how easy the conversation was. "Yeah, he's taking medicine now." "Cool. Hey, you want to play basketball? I bet I can hit you at horse." Just like that, life went on. Kyle didn't treat me any differently after knowing about Dad. We still played video games and rode bikes around the neighborhood. It made me realize that maybe Dad's illness wasn't something to be ashamed of. As Christmas approached, Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren decorated the house with lights and a big tree in the living room. They asked what traditions Dad and I had, trying to incorporate them. I told them about our tradition of making paper snowflakes to hang in the windows and how we always watched Home Alone on Christmas Eve. They made sure we did both those things. The best gift came a week before Christmas, when Uncle Raymond told me Dad was being released from the hospital. He wasn't coming to get me yet. He needed to establish a stable living situation first, but he was doing well enough to leave inpatient care. He would be staying in a supervised group home for a while, where he could have more independence while still having support. "Can I visit him?" I asked immediately. Uncle Raymond nodded. "We're planning to drive down for a day trip this weekend. Early Christmas present." I was so excited I could barely sleep the night before our visit. We drove the 4 hours back to our old town, stopping only once for bathroom breaks and snacks. The group home was in a residential neighborhood, a large house with a wraparound porch. It looked nothing like a hospital or institution, which was a relief. Dad was waiting for us in the living room. He looked so much better. He'd gained some weight, his hair was neatly trimmed, and his eyes were clear. He hugged me for a long time when I ran to him, lifting me off my feet like he used to do when I was smaller. "Look at you," he said, setting me down and stepping back to see me better. "You've grown at least an inch." He showed us around the house, introducing us to the staff and the other residents. There were 6 other people living there, all adults with various mental health issues who needed some supervision, but were stable enough to live semi-independently. Dad had his own room, small but private, with a twin bed and a desk. He'd put up pictures of me and some of his favorite bands on the walls. We went out for lunch at a diner Dad and I used to visit sometimes. It felt almost normal, sitting in a booth eating burgers and fries, Dad asking about school and my friends. Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren gave us some space, sitting at a separate table and talking quietly. "How are you really doing?" I asked Dad when we were alone. "Are you still seeing Josh?" Dad wiped his mouth with a napkin, considering his answer. "Sometimes, but it's different now. The medication helps me recognize what's real and what isn't, and I'm learning coping strategies for when the hallucinations do happen." "When can I come home?" I asked, the question I'd been holding back all day. Dad reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm working on it, buddy. I need to find us a place to live, get a job, show the court I can take care of you properly. It might take a few months." "The court?" I hadn't realized there would be legal stuff involved. "Just a formality," Dad assured me. "Because of what happened, there needs to be a hearing to determine custody arrangements. But Uncle Raymond is supporting me. We're on the same team." That was good to know. I'd been worried Uncle Raymond might try to keep me, especially since he and Aunt Lauren had been talking about wanting kids of their own. After lunch, we went to a park and played catch with a football Uncle Raymond brought. It was cold, our breath visible in the winter air, but it felt good to run around with Dad like old times. For a few hours, everything felt normal again. When it was time to leave, Dad walked us to the car. He gave me another long hug and told me he was proud of me for being so brave. I didn't feel brave, I just did what I had to do, but it was nice to hear. "I'll see you soon," he promised. "Keep being good for Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren." The drive back to Michigan was quieter than the trip there. I was happy to have seen Dad, but sad to leave him behind again. Uncle Raymond seemed to understand, turning on the radio instead of trying to make conversation. Back at school after winter break, I felt different. Seeing Dad doing better gave me hope that things might actually work out. I started participating more in class, raising my hand to answer questions and volunteering for group projects. My teacher, Mrs. Thompson, commented on the change, saying she was happy to see me coming out of my shell. I even told a few more friends about Dad after Kyle's positive reaction. Most of them were cool about it, though one kid named made a joke about crazy people. Kyle told him to shut up, and that was the end of that. It felt good having friends who stood up for me. In February, Dad called with exciting news. He'd found a job at a bookstore and was looking at apartments. The court had scheduled a hearing for April to review his progress and consider returning custody. Things were moving faster than expected because he was doing so well on his treatment plan. "That's awesome, Dad," I said, genuinely excited. "Does that mean I can come home in April? If all goes well at the hearing?" he said. No guarantees, but things are looking good. I told Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren the news. They seemed happy for me, but I caught them exchanging a look I couldn't quite interpret. Later that night, I overheard them talking in the kitchen while I was supposed to be doing homework. I'm worried it's too soon, Aunt Lauren was saying. He's only been out of the hospital for 2 months. The doctors wouldn't support it if they didn't think he was ready, Uncle Raymond replied. And you've seen how much the kid misses his dad. I know, but what if he relapses? What if he stops taking his medication again? Who will be there to protect the child? Their concerns made my stomach hurt. I hadn't considered the possibility that Dad might get worse again. What if the imaginary friends came back? What if Josh started telling him bad things again? I slipped back to my room before they could catch me eavesdropping, my mind racing with new worries. The next day, I asked Uncle Raymond directly if he thought Dad would get sick again. We were in the garage, where he was teaching me how to change the oil in his car. He wiped his hands on a rag and considered the question carefully. Your dad's illness is something he'll always have, he said finally. But with medication and therapy, most people with schizophrenia can live normal, productive lives. The important thing is that he sticks with his treatment. But what if he doesn't? I pressed. What if he thinks he's better and stops taking his medicine? Uncle Raymond put a hand on my shoulder. That's a valid concern, but your dad has learned from his mistakes. He knows what happens when he goes off his medication, and he'll have support this time. Doctors, social workers, and us. We're not abandoning you two. That was reassuring. I hadn't realized Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren planned to stay involved after I went back to Dad. The thought of having them as backup made me feel safer. March brought more progress. Dad found us a small 2-bedroom apartment not far from his group home. It was in a different neighborhood than our old place, which was probably good. Too many bad memories in the old apartment. He sent me pictures of the empty rooms, asking what color I wanted my bedroom painted. First, chose blue, like the sky on a clear day. Dad also started attending a support group for parents with mental illness. He told me about it during our weekly calls, how helpful it was to talk to other people facing similar challenges. One of the group members had recommended a book written for kids about parents with mental health issues. Dad bought it and sent it to me. It explained things in a way that made sense, with cartoons and simple language. I read it twice. As April approached, preparations for the custody hearing intensified. Uncle Raymond took me shopping for new clothes so I'd look nice in court. Aunt Lauren helped me practice what to say if the judge asked me questions. Dad called more frequently, sometimes just to check in for a few minutes between his therapy appointments and work shifts. The week before the hearing, something unexpected happened. I was getting ready for school when Uncle Raymond got a phone call. I could tell from his expression that something was wrong. He spoke in a low voice, asking questions and nodding seriously. When he hung up, he sat me down at the kitchen table. That was your dad's social worker, he said gently. Your dad had a setback yesterday. He's okay, but he's back in the hospital for a few days. My heart sank. What happened? Did he stop taking his medicine? Uncle Raymond shook his head. No, he's been great about that. But sometimes even with medication, symptoms can break through during times of stress. The hearing was making him anxious, and he started having more hallucinations. Is the hearing canceled? I asked, thinking of all our preparations. Postponed for now. The judge wants to see how your dad does over the next few weeks. I went to school that day feeling numb. It seemed like every time things started looking up, something knocked us back down. During lunch, I sat alone, not even wanting to talk to Kyle. I kept thinking about Dad back in the hospital, probably feeling like he'd failed me again. After school, I asked Uncle Raymond if I could call Dad. He made some calls and arranged for me to speak with him that evening. Dad sounded tired but otherwise okay. I'm sorry about the delay, he said. I got overwhelmed and didn't use the coping strategies I've been learning, but I recognized what was happening and asked for help right away. That's progress. Are you seeing Josh again? I asked quietly. Dad was silent for a moment. Yes, but differently now. I can tell he's not real, even when I can see and hear him. The doctors are adjusting my medication. I should be out in a few days. I told him I wasn't mad or disappointed, which was mostly true. I was sad and worried, but I understood better now that this was an illness, not a choice or a weakness. Dad was released from the hospital after 4 days, just as he'd predicted. The hearing was rescheduled for late May, giving him time to stabilize again. In the meantime, Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren arranged for me to visit Dad for a weekend. They would stay in a hotel nearby while I stayed with Dad at his new apartment, which he'd managed to secure despite the setback. The visit was both wonderful and strange. The apartment was smaller than our old one, and the furniture was mostly secondhand stuff Dad had found at thrift stores. But he'd worked hard to make my room special, with the blue walls I'd requested, and a new bedspread with planets on it, matching the backpack Uncle Raymond had given me. Dad had changed in subtle ways during our months apart. He was more organized now, keeping a detailed schedule on the refrigerator and setting alarms on his phone to remind him to take his medication. He cooked actual meals instead of relying on frozen dinners and takeout. He seemed more patient, less easily frustrated. We spent the weekend doing simple things, watching movies, playing board games, walking to a nearby park. Dad introduced me to his neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Chen, who had apparently been helping him with apartment hunting. She seemed nice, inviting us in for homemade cookies and asking me about school. On Sunday morning, before Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren came to pick me up, Dad and I had an important conversation. We sat at his small kitchen table, eating the pancakes he'd made, perfectly golden this time, not burnt like Aunt Shirley's. I want to talk about what happens if I get sick again, Dad said, his voice serious but calm. Because it might happen, and we need a plan. I nodded, appreciating that he wasn't sugarcoating things. I've worked with my treatment team to create a formal safety plan. Mrs. Chen has agreed to be part of it, but she's just one piece of the puzzle. The plan includes my doctors, a crisis response team, and professional support services. Okay, I had said, poking at my pancakes. What about Uncle Raymond? He and Aunt Lauren will still be in our lives. We'll visit them sometimes and you can call them anytime. They've agreed to be our backup plan if something more serious happens. The court and social services have approved this arrangement. Dad reached across the table and took my hand. The most important thing is that you feel safe. If you ever don't feel safe with me, I need you to tell someone. Mrs. Chen, a teacher, Uncle Raymond, anyone. Promise me that. I promised, though the conversation made me uncomfortable. I didn't like thinking about Dad getting sick again. One more thing, Dad continued. I've been completely honest with my doctors in the court about what happened before, about finding my diary and what was written there. I need you to know that those thoughts terrified me. I would never, ever hurt you. Those were symptoms of my illness, not my true feelings. I know, Dad, I said, and I meant it. The book he'd sent me had explained how schizophrenia sometimes put frightening thoughts in people's heads, thoughts that didn't reflect who they really were or what they wanted. When Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren arrived, Dad thanked them sincerely for taking care of me. There was no awkwardness or tension, just three adults who cared about me working together. It made me feel secure in a way I hadn't in a long time. Back in Michigan, the weeks crawled by as we waited for the May hearing. I threw myself into school and activities, trying not to count the days. Kyle invited me to join his baseball team, which was a good distraction. I wasn't very good, but the coach was patient, and it felt nice to be part of a team. Dad continued to do well. He sent me weekly letters in addition to our phone calls, sometimes including drawings or comics he'd made. He was seeing a therapist twice a week and attending his support group regularly. His boss at the bookstore even gave him more responsibilities, a sign that he was proving himself reliable. Finally, the day of the hearing arrived. We drove back to our hometown, me wearing the nice clothes Uncle Raymond had bought. I was nervous, my stomach doing flips as we entered the courthouse. Dad was already there, wearing a tie and looking as nervous as I felt. His social worker, a man named Nicholas, was with him, carrying a thick folder of documents. The hearing itself was less scary than I'd imagined. The judge, an older woman with silver hair and glasses, spoke directly to me, asking if I wanted to live with my dad again. I said yes, without hesitation. She asked if I understood my dad's illness and if I knew what to do if he seemed unwell. I explained about Mrs. Chen and the safety plan we'd discussed. Nicholas presented reports from Dad's doctors and employer, all positive. Uncle Raymond spoke too, saying he supported Dad regaining custody, but would remain involved in our lives. The judge listened carefully to everyone, taking notes and asking occasional questions. After about an hour, she made her decision. Dad would regain custody, but with conditions: continued therapy, regular check-ins with a social worker, and a review hearing in 6 months. Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren would have visitation rights, including having me stay with them for a few weeks in the summer. It wasn't a perfect solution. The supervision and check-ins felt a bit intrusive, but it meant I could go home with Dad. We hugged right there in the courtroom, both of us crying a little. Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren joined the hug, making it a group celebration. The next few days were a whirlwind of packing and goodbyes. My friends at school threw me a small going-away party. Kyle gave me his extra baseball glove so we could play when I visited in the summer. Aunt Lauren helped me pack my things, including some new clothes and books they'd bought me during my stay. The night before I left, Aunt Lauren came to my room to say goodnight. She sat on the edge of my bed, just like she had that night I'd had the nightmare about Josh. "I want you to know how proud I am of you," she said, smoothing my hair back from my forehead. "You've handled all of this with such maturity. Thanks for taking care of me," I said, suddenly feeling emotional about leaving. Despite everything, I'd grown to love Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren. "We'll always be here for you," she promised. "This isn't goodbye. Just see you later." The next morning, Dad arrived to pick me up. He'd rented a car for the trip, and we loaded my belongings into the trunk. The goodbyes were tearful, but not sad. Uncle Raymond made Dad promise to call when we got home safely. Aunt Lauren gave me a journal to write down my thoughts and feelings as I adjusted to being back with Dad. As we drove away, I looked back at the house that had been my home for nearly 6 months. I would miss it, and the people who lived there. But as I turned to look at Dad, smiling and humming along to the radio as he drove, I knew I was exactly where I belonged. "Ready for our new beginning?" Dad asked, reaching over to squeeze my hand. I squeezed back, feeling hopeful for the first time in a long time. "Ready?" The drive back to our new apartment felt surreal. Dad kept glancing over at me with this goofy smile like he couldn't believe I was really there. We stopped for burgers at some roadside place, and Dad let me get a chocolate milkshake even though it was barely noon. The whole time we talked about normal stuff, my baseball attempts with Kyle, Dad's job at the bookstore, the neighbors in our new building. It felt so ordinary, which was exactly what I wanted. When we finally pulled up to our new apartment building, I felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. It wasn't anything fancy, just a brick 3-story with a small patch of grass out front that barely qualified as a yard, but it was ours. Dad grabbed my backpack while I carried my duffel bag, and we headed up to the second floor. "Home sweet home," Dad said, unlocking the door to 2B. The apartment looked different with all Dad's stuff moved in. During my weekend visit, it had been half empty, but now there were books stacked on shelves, a TV in the corner, and framed photos on the walls. I noticed he'd hung up my school picture from last year and some old photos of us at the beach from when I was little. Mrs. Chen knocked on our door about an hour after we arrived, bringing a casserole that smelled like garlic and something spicy. She fussed over me, saying I was too skinny and needed feeding up. Dad just laughed and thanked her for the food. I could tell they had a good relationship, which made me feel better about her being our emergency contact. That first night back with Dad, I had trouble sleeping. Not because I was scared, but because everything felt different. The sounds of the building, the way the streetlight came through my blinds, the unfamiliar ceiling above me. I got up around midnight and found Dad sitting in the living room reading a book. "Can't sleep?" he asked, putting his book down. I shook my head and sat next to him on the couch. "Me neither," he admitted. "Too excited, I guess." We ended up watching late-night reruns of The Office until I finally dozed off on the couch. I woke up in my bed the next morning. Dad must have carried me there. The next few weeks were all about establishing our new normal. Dad had a strict routine that he followed religiously, medication at the same times every day, therapy appointments marked clearly on the calendar, support group meetings every Thursday night. During those meetings, I'd go to Mrs. Chen's apartment, and she'd teach me to make dumplings or help with my homework. My new school was okay. Being the new kid again sucked, but I was getting used to it. A girl named Catherine showed me around on my first day, and I started sitting with her and her friends at lunch. I didn't tell anyone about Dad's condition right away. I wanted to be known as just a regular kid first. Nicholas, Dad's social worker, visited our apartment every couple of weeks. He'd check in with both of us, look around the place, and ask a bunch of questions about how things were going. The first few visits were awkward, Dad getting all formal and nervous, but after a while, it just became part of our routine. Nicholas was actually pretty cool. He always asked about my baseball progress, and once brought me a comic book he thought I'd like. Uncle Raymond called every Sunday like clockwork. He and Aunt Lauren were planning to visit in July, and I was supposed to go stay with them for 2 weeks in August. I missed them more than I expected to, especially Aunt Lauren's pancakes, which were way better than Mrs. Chen's, though I'd never tell her that. About a month after moving back, I had my first real scare. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Dad talking. At first, I thought he was on the phone, but when I crept out to the hallway, I realized he was alone in the living room, having a conversation with empty space. My heart started racing immediately. "No, that's not true," Dad was saying, his voice tense but controlled. "You're not real, Josh. I know that now." I froze, unsure what to do. Dad had his back to me, so he didn't know I was there. I watched as he took deep breaths and repeated phrases I recognized from his therapy, grounding techniques they'd taught him. "I am in my apartment. It is 2:17 a.m. My son is asleep in his room. You are a hallucination. You are not real." After a few minutes of this, Dad got up and went to the kitchen. He took his emergency medication, the pills his doctor had prescribed for breakthrough symptoms, and washed them down with water. Then he sat at the kitchen table, head in his hands, waiting for them to work. I should have gone back to bed. That was the plan. If I ever saw Dad having symptoms, I was supposed to either go to my room or to Mrs. Chen's, but I couldn't leave him sitting there alone, looking so defeated. "Dad?" I said quietly, stepping into the kitchen. His head snapped up, eyes wide with surprise and then shame. "Hey buddy, did I wake you? I'm sorry. Is Josh here?" I asked, glancing around the empty kitchen. Dad sighed heavily. "He was. The medication will help. I'm following my plan, just like we talked about." I sat down across from him. "Does this happen a lot?" "Not a lot," Dad said carefully. "Maybe once every couple of weeks, usually when I'm tired or stressed, but I'm handling it." We sat in silence for a few minutes. I didn't know what to say, and I think Dad was embarrassed I'd caught him in a vulnerable moment. "Want some hot chocolate?" he finally asked, since we're both up anyway. So at nearly 3 a.m., we sat at our kitchen table drinking hot chocolate with mini marshmallows, talking about normal things until Dad's medication kicked in and the tension left his shoulders. It was weird, but also kind of nice in its own way. We were dealing with it together. The next morning, Dad talked to me about what happened. He explained that even with medication, sometimes symptoms break through, but it didn't mean he was getting worse or that I needed to worry. He had a plan, he was following it, and he was in control of the situation. I believed him because I'd seen it with my own eyes. He hadn't panicked or tried to hide what was happening. He'd faced it head on. I told Mrs. Chen about it later that week when I was at her apartment. She nodded wisely and said it was good that Dad was so open with me. Her son had diabetes, she explained, and they had similar middle-of-the-night episodes when his blood sugar got too low. Every family had something they dealt with. Ours just happened to be Dad's schizophrenia. Summer arrived, bringing warmer weather and freedom from school. Dad arranged his work schedule so he only had to work when I was at day camp or with Mrs. Chen. We settled into a comfortable routine, and I started to feel like maybe things really would be okay. In July, Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren came to visit for a long weekend. They stayed at a hotel nearby, but spent most of their time at our apartment. It was a little crowded with 4 people in our small space, but it was nice. Aunt Lauren brought cookies she'd baked, and Uncle Raymond taught Dad and me how to play poker, with pretzels instead of money. The best part was seeing how well Dad got along with them now. There was no tension or awkwardness, just family enjoying time together. On their last night in town, while Dad and I were walking them back to their hotel, Uncle Raymond put his arm around Dad's shoulders. "You're doing great, bro," he said simply. Dad just nodded, but I could tell those words meant a lot to him. August brought my 2-week visit to Michigan. I was excited to see Kyle and my other friends there, but nervous about leaving Dad alone. What if he had an episode worse than the one I'd witnessed? What if Josh came back and said bad things again? "I'll be fine," Dad assured me as we packed my suitcase. "I've got Mrs. Chen checking in on me, my support group, and Nicholas is making an extra visit while you're gone. Plus, I'll call you every night." "Promise you'll take your medication?" I asked, folding a t-shirt with more care than it needed. Dad stopped what he was doing and looked at me seriously. "I promise. I will never stop taking my medication again. That's a lifetime commitment." I believed him, but it was still hard getting on the plane by myself. even though I had one of those unaccompanied minor tags and a flight attendant checking on me every 5 minutes. When I landed in Michigan, seeing Aunt Lauren and Uncle Raymond waiting at the gate made me realize how much I'd missed them. The 2 weeks flew by in a blur of baseball games, swimming at the community pool, and video game marathons with Kyle. I called Dad every night, and he sounded good, tired from work sometimes, but stable and happy. He told me he'd joined a book club at the store where he worked and was thinking about taking an online class in graphic design, something he'd been interested in before he got sick. When it was time to go home, I was ready. I missed Dad and our apartment, and even Mrs. Chen's dumplings. Uncle Raymond drove me to the airport, and we had a good talk on the way. "You know, your dad and I weren't always close," he told me, keeping his eyes on the road. "After Josh died, he pushed everyone away. I should have tried harder to help him back then." "You're helping now," I pointed out. Uncle Raymond smiled. "Yeah, I guess we all got a second chance to do better. That's pretty rare in life." Dad was waiting at the airport when I landed, waving excitedly as I came through the gate. He looked good. He'd gotten a haircut and was wearing a new shirt I hadn't seen before. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, then grabbed my bag and led me to the parking lot, asking a million questions about my trip. School started again in September. I was no longer the new kid, which was nice. I'd made a few solid friends over the summer, including Catherine and a boy named Sean who lived in our building. I still didn't talk much about Dad's condition, but I didn't actively hide it either. When Catherine asked why a social worker sometimes picked me up from school, I just told her Dad had a mental illness and was getting help for it. She said her mom had depression and saw a therapist, so it wasn't a big deal to her. Our 6-month review hearing came in November. I was nervous about it, remembering how the last hearing had been postponed when Dad had his setback, but things went smoothly this time. Nicholas gave a positive report, and even the judge seemed impressed with our progress. She reduced the frequency of the social worker visits to once a month and said we wouldn't need another formal review for a full year. "You've done exemplary work, Mr. Davis," she told Dad. "It's clear how committed you are to your son's well-being." Dad couldn't stop smiling as we left the courthouse. We celebrated by going out for pizza, and he let me get an extra large with all my favorite toppings. As Christmas approached, Dad and I started our old traditions again, making paper snowflakes for the windows and planning our movie night. But we added some new traditions too. We volunteered at a food bank on Thanksgiving, something Dad's support group had organized, and we invited Mrs. Chen to join us for Christmas dinner, since her son was spending the holiday with his in-laws in California. Uncle Raymond and Aunt Lauren sent presents that arrived a week before Christmas. New baseball gear for me and a fancy coffee maker for Dad. We video chatted with them on Christmas Eve, showing off our decorated apartment. They were planning to visit again in February for my birthday. The night before Christmas, after we'd watched Home Alone and I was getting ready for bed, Dad came into my room with a small wrapped package. "I know we usually do presents in the morning," he said, sitting on the edge of my bed, "but I wanted to give you this one now." I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a journal, similar to the one Aunt Lauren had given me, but with a blue leather cover and my initials embossed on the front. "I've been keeping a journal as part of my therapy," Dad explained. "It helps me sort through my thoughts and track my progress. I thought you might want your own." "Thanks, Dad," I said, running my fingers over the smooth cover. "There's something else," Dad continued, looking a bit nervous. "I've been thinking about Josh a lot lately, not hallucinating him, just remembering the real Josh, my friend. I realized I've never really told you about him." "The real Josh?" I repeated, surprised. We'd talked plenty about Dad's hallucinations of Josh, but never much about the actual person he'd been. Dad nodded. "He wasn't just the guy who died in the car accident. Before that, he was my best friend since kindergarten. He taught me to ride a bike. He helped me ask a girl to prom. He was funny and loyal, and a really good person who made one terrible mistake that cost him his life." I didn't know what to say. Josh had always been this scary figure in my mind, the imaginary friend who made Dad throw plates and cry and write terrible things in his diary. "I thought maybe tomorrow, if you want, I could tell you some stories about the real Josh," Dad continued. "Show you some old photos. He was an important part of my life, and I think it might help both of us if he wasn't just this scary secret anymore." "I'd like that," I said, and I meant it. I was curious about the real person behind the hallucination that had shaped so much of our lives. Dad smiled and kissed my forehead before leaving the room. I stayed up a while longer, looking at my new journal and thinking about everything that had happened in the past year. I decided to write my first entry. "A year ago, I thought my dad had imaginary friends who made him sad and angry," I wrote. "Now I know he has schizophrenia, which sometimes makes him see and hear things that aren't there. But I also know he's still my dad, and he's doing everything he can to stay healthy and take care of me." I paused, tapping my pen against the page, then continued. "Tomorrow, Dad's going to tell me about the real Josh. I'm a little nervous, but mostly curious. Dad says he was a good person who made a mistake. I guess everyone makes mistakes. The important part is what you do afterward." I closed the journal and put it in my bedside drawer. Through the wall, I could hear Dad moving around in the kitchen, probably setting up the coffee maker for morning. The sound was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't alone anymore. Our life wasn't perfect. Dad still had bad days sometimes. I still worried more than other kids my age. We still had social worker visits and therapy appointments and medication schedules to follow. But we were making it work, one day at a time, and that was enough.